The American president has barely left Beijing, and Xi Jinping is already rolling out the red carpet for his next high-profile guest, Vladimir Putin. The image they want to project is one of two superpowers shaping a new world order. But the fault lines are evident. Russia remains largely isolated by the West because of the war in Ukraine and economically dependent on China. Beijing, in turn, is fueling its growth with rising state debt. At the same time, the threat of a confrontation with the U.S. over Taiwan looms large. Today, we ask, Trump, Putin, or Xi? Who really runs the world? Welcome to The Point. I'm Nicole Fröhlich in Berlin, and I'm pleased to introduce today's panel. I'm joined by Mareike Olberg. She's a senior fellow in the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific program, where she leads the Stockholm China Forum. Bernhard Bartsch is also with us. He's the Director of External Relations at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. And DW correspondent Sergei Satanovsky joins us on the line from Riga. That's where our Moscow team has been based since DW was banned from Russia. Thank you all for joining us today. Mareike, I want to start with you. First Trump, now Putin. China sees itself at the center of a new world order. Do you see a shift happening here?
China certainly has much better credentials and credibility now to present itself as the new center of a new world order that is in the making. One of the things that China always highlights is that we're seeing changes unseen in a century. So there's clearly a big shift in world order, and China sees it as necessary to shape the new world order that is emerging. Now, how much of that is actual form and pictures and images and how China projects itself, and how much of that is substance is a different question, just like how much responsibility China actually wants to take to run a world order that is complex, that requires responsibility. That's another open question. And overall, China does not want to have the responsibility. It wants to look good. It wants to have more power, especially vis-a-vis the United States, which is kind of the only peer great power that China aspires to catch up with and overtake. But it doesn't necessarily want to come with all the responsibilities that come with actually sitting on top of a world order that you've shaped.
Yeah. Bernhard, let's look at the delegations that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin brought to China. Trump came with a bunch of tech CEOs. The Russian leader was flanked by energy executives. What does that tell us about how power is defined nowadays, the nature of power that we're talking about here, and one where China really is positioning itself as the leader without having to take necessarily all the responsibility that come with world leadership?
Well, China wants to be engaged with the whole world on its own terms, obviously. So the big tech companies in the US, in Silicon Valley, are interesting for China as competitors, but many of them have also put large bets on the Chinese market. Elon Musk with Tesla, for example. For them, the question is, to what extent can they decouple from China, or is there money to be made in China? Russia is a whole different game. Russia is exporting mainly fossil fuels to China, and that's one of the major sources of income for Russia nowadays. And they were hoping to get a major pipeline deal. That didn't happen. But on the other hand, Russia does import a lot of tech stuff, dual-use items from China. So it's very, very different relationships.
Yeah. Sergei, Putin was very adamant about the fact that his visit to Beijing has nothing to do with Trump's visit. Is that really the case?
Yeah, I think it is the case. Of course, China is Russia's main partner in terms of imports and exports, and he had a lot to discuss with Xi Jinping. He's had a lot of meetings with him already, about 40, they say. So Vladimir Putin's goal was very simple, of course. He had three goals, I guess. The first one was very political. Of course, he wanted to show that his country, once again, is not isolated, because he's been losing partners. He's been losing. He just lost Hungary. He's been losing Armenia, something is happening in Iran. So this is a good moment to stand next to Xi Jinping and say that once again we have a very strong and reliable partner. Of course, not everything went well as well, the guest just mentioned. They really wanted to sign an agreement on this pipeline. It's called Power of Siberia, and this would connect Russia's extraction sites in Siberia to the China's territory. It didn't happen now, and I guess this was a failure. But yeah, the third point, of course, it's the war in Ukraine is still ongoing, and it's important for Putin to get some strategical reassurance, so to say, that to make it clear that China wouldn't abandon Russia wouldn't abandon Russia in the case if this war were to protract.
I want to talk about the war in Ukraine a little later, but Mareike, first I want to talk about the optics here, because these back-to-back visits, coincidental or not, they're a gift in terms of optics for Xi, aren't they?
I mean, they're a gift for Xi Jinping in that he can first show that he can have this meeting with Donald Trump, and then right after that, of course, he can still, because he can make those decisions, he can still meet with Vladimir Putin and show that no, Russia is not that isolated. No, we can still work with Russia. Nobody can tell us not to do that. I mean, obviously, Europe has been trying to get China to distance itself from Russia. That is clearly not happening and never was going to happen. That said, I also don't want to overinterpret any of the the sequencing here or the fact that they met right after another. I mean, Donald Trump's visit was postponed several times, and that could very well be part of why that worked out.
Absolutely, but the fact that they are coming to Beijing, right? That's a coup in and of itself, right? He is there basically holding court, and the world's biggest leaders are coming to him.
Yes, but it's about much more than optics. Basically, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have a very big joint agenda that they're driving, which is basically to replace the Western world order. And what connects these visits is, of course, that Xi, Putin, and Trump, I guess all three of them, see themselves as the three people driving world affairs, but Russia and China are in a deep rivalry with the US and in different stages of stabilizing that. Xi has been very successful in de-escalating that and showing his strength and getting respect from the US. Putin and Trump, I guess, let's not go too deep into kitchen psychology. They match psychologically, but of course they have a deep rivalry going on, and the whole question of how they position themselves is up in the air.
Yeah. Before we continue, let's take a look at these meetings, because President Xi, they're holding court. For many, it was a golden PR opportunity, and it was eagerly exploited by the country's propaganda machine.
China is proudly positioning itself as the driving force behind global politics as world leaders are invited to meet with President Xi Jinping. Currently, it's Russian President Vladimir Putin. The purpose of the visit? A strategic alliance against Western dominance and a warning. The world today is far from peaceful, with unilateralism and hegemonism posing profound dangers. The world faces the risk of regressing to the law of the jungle. China does not explicitly call on Russia to end the war against Ukraine, though it recommends negotiations. Xi views the Russian president as a relatively weak partner, despite numerous joint agreements. Shortly before, the same setting with a different guest, US President Trump in Beijing. China positions itself as a central global power that maintains good relations with both Russia and the US. But Xi has been firm with Trump on one issue: Taiwan. If the US takes the wrong side, Xi warns, it could threaten bilateral relations. Is China on its way to becoming a dominant world power?
That's the question we're trying to answer today. But first, let's look at these two meetings. What were the parallels you saw and the key differences, maybe more importantly, of these two meetings, Putin there and Trump?
I guess the main effort for Xi vis-a-vis Trump was to show his strength and continue this path that's been there for the last year, the first year of the Trump presidency, of showing that China is not pushed and messed around with. They've showed this with the rare earth embargoes and the threat of extending them. So he has earned a lot of respect in the US, and Trump has seen that he can bully a lot of countries, but with China he has to be very careful. That's a huge win. They're now at eye level with the US and the US president. Well, and I already mentioned that Xi and Putin have a joint agenda of reshaping the world order. To some extent, I guess one could say that Putin is a useful idiot for Xi Jinping because he pushes the boundaries, he tests the West, he tests our security capabilities of defending Ukraine. China watches that very closely and takes its own conclusions.
Yeah. Sergei, Bennett says that Putin might be Xi's useful idiot. I guess the Russian leader might beg to differ here, but tell us just how much Russia depends economically on China, and especially to keep the war in Ukraine going.
Well, Russia depends, as you mentioned, of course, very much on China. China is basically a monopolist, both in Russia's imports. They import a lot of electronics, machinery, vehicles from China, and China also accounts for more than a quarter of Russia's exports, which are crude oil, natural gas, coal. So basically, Russia's economy cannot quite well function without China. And before the war in Ukraine started, Russia, of course, was very cautious about this moment because they didn't want some political influence to follow this economic dependence. And some of the Kremlin-linked think tanks tried to come up with a strategy how to avoid that, but once the war in Ukraine started, they decided to just forget about it for the moment. But this moment now has been lasting more than 4 years, and Russia just doesn't know and doesn't want to think about what to do about this. And that's why, by the way, some experts say this pipeline, the Power of Siberia 2, was important for the Kremlin. It's important to start building it because it would, from the Kremlin's perspective, somehow bring balance to these lopsided economic relations between Russia and China, because it would make China much more dependent on Russia's fossil fuels than it is now.
Mareike, both leaders, and especially right before the war in Ukraine started, stressed their no-limits friendship, right? It's something we've heard repeated often. What's the basis of that friendship, though? Is it purely disdain for the West?
I mean, the simple answer is yes. The long answer is China and Russia are not perfect friends or allies. They have their own conflicts, they have their own differences, but we keep, or at least I have been seeing people saying, oh, maybe we can drive a wedge between them. There was this whole idea, oh, maybe Trump can drive a wedge between the two, right, just by playing them against each other. And the problem with that is because they have both defined their main enemy as, you know, the United States and the global order as it exists, which they both consider unfair and in need of replacement with something different. That is the main conflict. That's the main problem. And China is going to make sure that Russia is not going to get weakened vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis NATO, vis-a-vis the existing order, because that is its priority. That is kind of what in older times used to be called the principal conflict, the principal contradiction on a global scale, right? So you need to throw your main power at that, your principal opponent and the principal contradiction that you're trying to solve to emerge stronger from that. So yes, there's problems with Russia. It's not perfect, but that is going to be really, really hard to exploit, except maybe ad hoc occasionally, because simply China does not view Russia as its main problem.
Yeah. Sergei, it really sounds like Russia is the junior partner here. How does that go down with the strongmen in the Kremlin?
Yeah, well, of course, Russia doesn't want to be a junior partner, but that's the reality. Of course, Russia wants to be a kind of a pole, right, in this multi-polar world that Russia and China agreed to build. But economically, obviously, Russia can't even be compared to China or the United States. And its power, Russia's power, mostly comes from nuclear weapons, from some psychological intelligence operations. It comes from its willingness, basically, to disrupt. So Russia is not relevant, obviously, to this in this multipolar world. But at the same time, it's not equal with China. And of course, this is something that Russia and the Kremlin realize. And Russia is not running the world, obviously, but it is trying to make the world kind of unmanageable without it by disrupting it.
Mm-hmm. Bennett, let's examine the relationship between Donald Trump and Xi. We saw a lot of flattery, mostly coming from the U.S. president towards the Chinese president, though. Does he misread what Xi wants? How is that received on the Chinese side? That rapprochement, that warm leader-to-leader approach that we've seen Donald Trump take, as opposed to what the standard policy earlier on was?
I'm quite sure that Xi Jinping liked that, and the Chinese media, social media, like this.
Does he respect it, though?
I don't think they have any illusions about Donald Trump. I think they feel that they can play him. He's useful. I guess from a Chinese perspective, Donald Trump is the best US president they've had in decades. Because a lot of the hardwired policies that go in a decoupling direction that the Republicans and Democrats established over the last decades, really, are undermined by Trump's personal family rent-seeking and his approach where he tried to push China very early on last year, and China pushed back. And now Trump is obviously afraid of what China could do, so he wants to de-escalate this tension. And this is really a present for Xi Jinping because everyone else sees it too. We Europeans see it. We know the US is shying away from conflict with China, and that is a moment that China has worked a long time for. They've earned it in their own sense.
What is the direct consequence of the US shying away from this confrontation with China and taking a remarkably soft stance on issues like Taiwan, for example?
That's the million-dollar question, where that's going to end up. There is still an element of unpredictability. And if you ask supporters of Donald Trump, they would, of course, say, well, yes, he might be doing all this, but ultimately the unpredictability is what's going to keep China in check on this. The problem with that is that we're seeing a lot of gains that we've made painstakingly under the Biden administration. We're seeing that lost, that there is an erosion of some of the measures on China. I mean, so far we'll see where that ends up. But I do think it actually increases the risk of more pressure on Taiwan. Not necessarily a military invasion. I don't think that is something that that's China's preference. I think it would much rather incorporate Taiwan formally into its territory without having to bring out the military. But we're going to see a lot more pressure on Taiwan, and we're going to see a lot more pressure on third countries to act in China's interests on Taiwan, whether that is, blocked overflights when the Taiwanese president tries to fly to Africa, right? It becomes a lot more difficult because China can pressure countries to say, oh, the airspace can't be used, right? We see a lot more measures like that, and there's going to be, I think, less pushback around that, including possibly from the United States. One more example, the United States is obligated by law to sell weapons to Taiwan, as the weapons package, and that's been held up because Trump is like, oh, I don't know if I want to sell it to them or not, right? Because there's a pressure from the Chinese side. And he is more likely, or has shown himself to be more likely to budge on that and to be differential to Chinese interests than other presidents have in the past.
As well, right? Because it was standard practice and it was understood by many, many administrations that these matters were not to be discussed with China.
That's exactly the point. It's a window of opportunity for China to try to shift the relationship back to a stage where it was much more advantageous to China. They see that window of opportunity to use those years where Trump is there, obviously try to lock it in as much as possible, but also just to buy China time, for the U.S. to ease up on certain measures. That buys China time to actually strengthen itself, to solve some of its own problems. China is not almighty, right? It suffers from many problems, including on the economic side, right? So it gives China breathing room, and they're really seeing this window of opportunity. And so far, unfortunately, it looks like it's been more successful than it should have been.
Yeah. I want to look at where Europe sits in all of this, because we've seen a number of European leaders too travel to Beijing. Keir Starmer went, Chancellor Merz went, the Spanish Prime Minister also recently went to Beijing. In this new world order that China is pursuing, where does Europe stand? Are they a player? Are they a spectator? Or are they the battlefield?
We must be a player, but we sit in a very uncomfortable spot because a lot of the institutions and the international norms and laws are undermined. The West is not as cohesive as it used to be. China is moving into all the vacancies that the US leaves. So for us, it's a very uncomfortable world. The US, China, and Russia play a very hard-nosed geopolitical, geoeconomic game. That is nothing that we've been trained. It's a muscle that we don't really have. We're building it up now, and we have to build up a lot of muscles at the same time. The hard security one, the economic
fast enough, though, because the others, they're moving pretty swiftly.
That's the big question, and I don't want to be defeatist here. I think a lot of good things are coming out of Brussels. I think it's understood where the challenge is. Then the EU can only be as strong as its big member states mandated. Germany isn't exactly an example of giving the EU a strong mandate beyond German core interests there. So it's a race against time, and we need to be clear-eyed that this is a race where we may actually lose a lot. We are losing a lot, I guess, already.
Sergei, Russia and China, they signed a declaration at the end of their meeting advocating for a multipolar world order. Where do they see Europe fitting into that new world order?
Well, it's a good question. They don't mention that exactly. They basically want to Europe, I guess, to be one of the actors. But it's interesting that they also don't see and state that the US or Europe as an enemy. There was a moment during Putin's visit where he was meeting a Chinese engineer, and he mentioned that this meeting was taking place on a very symbolic date. Because 70 years ago, Mao Zedong held his speech against American imperialism, and immediately he had to say that, but right now we are not fighting against any we're not fighting against anyone, we are just fighting for our interests, and we are ready to cooperate with anyone, with the United States, with Europe, it doesn't matter. So they don't seem to be in an alliance against the rest of the world.
Mareike, how can Europe build leverage in this evolving ecosystem?
Europe has a lot of leverage on the economic side. Technically we have a huge market. We have some instruments already that we could use more aggressively if we were able to build up the full political will backed by key member states to use them and to actually throw our weight around. Right now, the problem is not necessarily that we don't have anything. We have a huge market, and we do have instruments that we could use both against China or against the United States, depending on the relationship. But there's you need political will for that, and you need backing for that, and that's the problem that we're going to have to solve.
Bernhard, last question to you. Briefly, if you can, what factor do you think is going to decide the quest for world dominance?
Hard economic power and tech power, and I think China, unfortunately for us, is playing a very strong game there.
And that's all the time we have today. I want to thank all of you for contributing and everyone watching. I hope this helped you figure out what the point of everything is. All of you, thank you for helping us get to the point, and join us again next week. Bye-bye.